Have you ever wondered why your ex seems to remember your relationship completely differently than you do? The self-serving bias explains why avoidants rewrite every breakup story, turning themselves into the misunderstood hero while casting you as the villain who simply wanted too much. This isn't just petty revisionist history. It's a powerful psychological defense mechanism that protects their fragile sense of self while keeping them emotionally distant from the truth. When someone with an avoidant attachment style ends a relationship, their brain immediately gets to work crafting a narrative that serves their emotional needs. They don't sit down and consciously decide to lie about what happened. Instead, their mind automatically filters memories, emphasizes certain events, and downplays others to create a story where they emerge blameless and justified. Think of it like Blair Waldorf from Gossip Girl editing her own reality show. Except instead of designer outfits and social drama, they're editing out their emotional unavailability and commitment issues. This cognitive restructuring serves a crucial purpose for the avoidant mind. By reframing the breakup as something that happened to them, rather than something they participated in creating, they maintain their sense of independence and superiority. They convince themselves that their partner was simply too needy, too clingy, or too demanding. Meanwhile, they were the reasonable one who tried their best, but couldn't deal with someone so emotionally intense. It's a perfect narrative that requires zero self-reflection or accountability. But here's where it gets particularly insidious. The self-serving bias doesn't just change how they remember the past. It actively shapes how they interpret current and future relationships. Each rewritten breakup story becomes evidence that supports their core belief that emotional intimacy is dangerous and that people who want closeness are inherently problematic. They're not just protecting themselves from the pain of one relationship ending. They're building a fortress of justifications that will keep them safely isolated from genuine connection for years to come. What makes this even more challenging is that avoidants genuinely believe their revised version of events. They're not lying when they tell friends that you were too possessive or that the relationship failed because you couldn't give them space. Their brain has already reorganized the facts to support this conclusion. When they recall that time you asked to spend Saturday together, they don't remember that it had been 2 weeks since your last real conversation. They just remember feeling suffocated by your request and how unreasonable it seemed. The confirmation bias works hand in hand with their self-serving narrative. Once they've decided that the relationship failed because their partner was too demanding, every memory gets filtered through that lens. Your attempts to connect become evidence of clinginess. Your efforts to communicate about problems become proof of your neediness. Your emotional reactions to their withdrawal become validation that you were too intense for them to handle. It's like Joe Goldberg from the Netflix series You, except instead of obsessing over someone, they're obsessing over why that someone was all wrong for them. Understanding this pattern isn't about excusing their behavior or convincing yourself to take them back. It's about protecting your own mental health and sense of reality. When someone systematically rewrites history to make themselves look better, it can leave their former partners questioning their own memories and wondering if maybe they really were too much. If you want to better understand someone's attachment style, see the link in the description to one of the most popular books on attachment theory. Picture a couple named Marcus and Sarah who dated for 8 months. From Sarah's perspective, Marcus was charming and attentive at first, but gradually became more distant and unavailable. He would cancel plans last minute, go days without meaningful communication, and seemed uncomfortable whenever she tried to discuss their future together. When she brought up these concerns, he would dismiss them or change the subject. Eventually, she reached a breaking point and told him she needed more emotional connection and consistency if their relationship was going to continue. Marcus ended things the next day, saying he couldn't be with someone so demanding. But that's not the story he tells his friends or even himself. In his version, Sarah was clingy from the beginning. She was always trying to control his schedule and couldn't handle his need for independence. He tried to be patient with her insecurity, but she kept pushing for more commitment than he was ready to give. When she gave him an ultimatum about changing who he was, he realized he had to end things for both of their sakes. He's genuinely convinced that he was the mature one who recognized their incompatibility and made the difficult but necessary decision to walk away. But here's what's particularly fascinating about Marcus's mental gymnastics. His brain didn't just forget about his own behavior. It actively recontextualized every interaction to support his preferred narrative. When Sarah suggested they spend more time together, his mind filed it under evidence of her neediness rather than recognizing it as a reasonable request from someone he was supposedly dating. When she got upset about his last-minute cancellations, he remembered her emotional reaction, but not the pattern of unreliability that caused it. This selective memory isn't unique to romantic relationships either. Marcus applies the same cognitive filters to friendships, family relationships, and even professional situations. When his business partner expressed frustration about Marcus's lack of follow-through on important projects, Marcus decided his partner was too controlling and micromanaging. When his sister stopped inviting him to family gatherings after years of him canceling at the last minute, he concluded that she was being petty and exclusionary. The common thread in all these stories is that other people's reasonable expectations become unreasonable demands, and their natural emotional responses become character flaws. The tragedy is that Marcus genuinely believes he's a good person who keeps encountering difficult people. He doesn't wake up in the morning planning to hurt anyone or manipulate situations to his advantage. His self-serving bias operates below the level of conscious awareness, automatically protecting his ego from the uncomfortable truth that his avoidant patterns are damaging his relationships. Each rewritten story reinforces his belief that emotional distance is not just preferable, but necessary for dealing with the unreasonable people in his world. What makes this pattern particularly heartbreaking is how it perpetuates itself. Every time Marcus rewrites a breakup story to cast himself as the victim of someone else's excessive needs, he becomes more convinced that vulnerability and closeness are dangerous. His mental narrative tells him that he tried to be open and caring, but people took advantage of his good nature and demanded too much. This false lesson ensures that he'll be even more guarded in his next relationship, creating the exact same dynamic that led to the previous breakup. Sarah, meanwhile, is left trying to make sense of a relationship that apparently meant something completely different to each of them. She remembers specific conversations, concrete examples of his emotional unavailability, and her own attempts to communicate about problems in a loving way. But Marcus's confident retelling of their story makes her question her own perceptions. Was she really too needy? Did she actually demand too much? This is how the avoidant self-serving bias doesn't just protect them from accountability, but actively transfers blame and confusion to their former partner. Now you might be wondering how to protect yourself from getting caught up in someone else's revisionist history. The first step is understanding that this behavior isn't really about you at all. When an avoidant person rewrites your relationship story to make themselves look better, they're revealing something about their own psychological needs rather than providing accurate feedback about your behavior. Their version of events is designed to serve their emotional comfort, not to reflect objective reality. Learning to trust your own memories and experiences is crucial when dealing with someone who unconsciously distorts the truth. Keep a journal if you need to, or confide in trusted friends who witnessed the relationship dynamics firsthand. Like Emily Cooper from Emily in Paris navigating the complex social dynamics of a new culture, you need reliable reference points to help you distinguish between what actually happened and what someone else needs to believe happened. The second essential strategy is recognizing the patterns rather than getting lost in the specific details of any one interaction. Avoidant individuals don't just rewrite breakup stories. They consistently reinterpret situations to minimize their own responsibility and maximize other people's flaws. If your ex claims that every single one of their previous partners was too clingy or demanding, that's not a coincidence. It's a red flag indicating that they have a systematic bias in how they process relationship conflicts. Understanding the anchor bias can also help you navigate these situations more effectively. This cognitive bias causes people to rely too heavily on the first piece of information they encounter when making decisions. In the context of avoidant rewriting, they often anchor on their initial feeling of discomfort or overwhelm when faced with emotional intimacy, then interpret everything that follows through that lens. Your request to talk about the relationship gets anchored to their discomfort with vulnerability, so it becomes evidence of your excessive neediness rather than normal relationship maintenance. Start setting boundaries around these conversations early in relationships. When someone consistently reframes your reasonable requests as unreasonable demands, don't exhaust yourself trying to prove that your needs are valid. Instead, pay attention to the pattern and consider whether this person is capable of the kind of mutual accountability that healthy relationships require. Think of it like Serena van der Woodsen from Gossip Girl, learning to recognize when someone is more interested in drama than genuine connection. The availability heuristic is another cognitive bias that plays into this dynamic. People tend to judge the likelihood of events based on how easily they can recall examples. For avoidant individuals, memories of feeling overwhelmed or suffocated are often more vivid and accessible than memories of times when they felt safely connected. This means they're more likely to overestimate how demanding their partners actually were, because the moments of feeling crowded stick out more prominently in their memory than the many quiet moments of comfortable companionship. Developing your own emotional intelligence becomes a powerful tool for navigating these dynamics. Learn to recognize the difference between someone who struggles with vulnerability but takes responsibility for their patterns versus someone who consistently blames their relationship problems on other people's excessive needs. The former might be worth your patience and support. The latter is likely to keep you trapped in cycles of confusion and self-doubt. Practice articulating your own needs and boundaries clearly and calmly, but don't fall into the trap of thinking that if you just explain yourself well enough, an avoidant person will suddenly see the situation clearly. Their self-serving bias isn't based on misunderstanding your perspective. It's based on their psychological need to protect themselves from the discomfort of acknowledging their own role in relationship difficulties. Consider the sunk cost fallacy as well. This bias leads people to continue investing in situations because of previously invested resources, even when it's no longer beneficial to do so. If you find yourself constantly trying to convince an avoidant ex that your version of the relationship was accurate, you might be falling victim to this bias. The time and emotional energy you've already invested in trying to get them to see the truth doesn't mean you should keep investing more. Building a support network of people who knew you during the relationship can provide valuable perspective when someone tries to rewrite your shared history. These friends and family members can remind you of who you actually were and how you actually behaved during that time period. They serve as external validators for your reality when someone else's self-serving narrative tries to convince you that you were the problem. Most importantly, focus on what you can learn about yourself and what you want in future relationships, rather than getting trapped in debates about what really happened in past ones. The avoidant person's need to rewrite history reveals their limitations, not yours. Your job isn't to convince them of the truth or to fix their cognitive biases. Your job is to protect your own mental health and choose relationships with people who can engage in honest self-reflection. Remember that cognitive biases exist in all of us, not just in avoidant individuals. The difference is that healthy people can acknowledge when their biases are affecting their judgment and work to correct for them. They can sit with the discomfort of recognizing their own mistakes and take responsibility for their role in relationship problems. Someone who consistently uses self-serving bias to avoid accountability isn't just struggling with attachment issues, they're struggling with basic relationship skills that are necessary for any successful partnership. The self-serving bias that drives avoidant individuals to rewrite every breakup story isn't just about protecting their ego in the moment. It's a systematic pattern that prevents them from learning and growing from their relationship experiences. Each time they convince themselves that a relationship failed because their partner was too needy or demanding, they miss an opportunity to understand how their own emotional unavailability contributed to the problems. This pattern creates a tragic irony. The very mechanism they use to protect themselves from emotional pain actually guarantees that they'll experience more of it in the long run. By refusing to acknowledge their role in relationship difficulties, they ensure that they'll repeat the same patterns with every new partner. They become like Beck from the Netflix series You, trapped in cycles that feel beyond their control because they can't see their own part in creating them. For those who have been on the receiving end of this revisionist history, the path forward requires both self-compassion and clear boundaries. You cannot force someone to see the truth about what happened between you, but you can refuse to participate in conversations that consistently distort your reality. You can trust your own memories and experiences even when someone else needs to believe a different version of events. The most powerful thing you can do is use this understanding to make better choices in future relationships. Look for partners who can acknowledge their mistakes, apologize sincerely when they hurt you, and work collaboratively to solve problems rather than assigning blame. Choose people who see your emotional needs as information to be considered rather than demands to be resisted. Understanding the self-serving bias doesn't mean you should excuse harmful behavior or convince yourself to be more patient with people who consistently avoid accountability. Instead, it should empower you to recognize these patterns early and protect yourself from getting caught up in someone else's need to rewrite reality. Your emotional well-being is too valuable to sacrifice on the altar of someone else's cognitive biases. Trust yourself. Choose relationships with people who can engage in honest self-reflection. And remember that the right person for you won't need to rewrite your love story to make themselves feel better about how it ended.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.